You know, we're in 2019 and we think, have we not learned something? Why is it that we just struggle so much with living peacefully one with another, whether it be in our homes, at work, on the highway, commuting to work, in our countries, abroad? We just wonder what it would take for us to finally have the means to live peacefully as human beings together. I was struck by the words that Jesus said that Wynne read for us this morning. These words seem powerful on a day like today. No greater love than putting your life on the line for a friend. And how many thousands of people did indeed do that in the First World War and the Second World War and wars before that and wars that followed that. And yet the great commandment that Jesus said to us was, love one another as I have loved you. And of course, we always remember the words following that, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I think I've been pretty lucky with my neighbors. Anybody have a neighbor that it's hard to love sometimes? Why did they put the fence down that side? When are they going to cut that tree down that keeps dumping the fruit on my side of the fence? Sometimes it's hard to be neighborly. And yet Jesus says to us, we are to love one another and love our neighbors as we love ourselves. I think it's also Jesus who said that we are to love our enemies. Those are pretty powerful words. If we can't even get along with our neighbor, how can we get along with somebody that we think of as an enemy? Well, there's a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Gladwell. Many of you may have heard of him. He's written several books that have been top sellers, Outliers, David and Goliath, The Tipping Point. His most recent book is called Talking to Strangers. I thought, sometimes I think I could put in the word stranger when Jesus says love your neighbor or love your enemy. I think we're also called to love the stranger. Because there's no reason why we shouldn't love the stranger. They're a human being. Just because we don't know them, that shouldn't really make a difference. So the premise of Malcolm's book is that he suggests that our conditions today are such that there seems to be a pattern where two people meet, they try to communicate, they fail miserably, and then it leads to dire circumstances. He talks a lot about some events that happened in the United States, in particular the story of Sandra Bland. Does anyone remember the name Sandra Bland? I think it was July of 2014 or 15. She was a young aspiring professional. She had graduated from university, born and raised in Chicago, a Black woman, well-educated, on her way to a new job in Texas. She was working at a university and then pursuing her master's degree as well. And so she turned out of the campus one day on her way to do an errand and turned out onto the highway and failed to put her turn signal on. And she was pulled over by a police officer. The police officer confronted her and she, of course, said, I wasn't aware of doing anything. Well, within minutes, the conversation escalated, and the next thing you know, he was forcing her out of the car by gunpoint and arresting her. The whole time she was protesting, what have I done? I haven't done anything. Why are you doing this? It made headlines because sadly, I'm sorry to say that 3 days later in jail, she committed suicide. And so she was one of another person caught up in what we now know as Black Lives Matter movement. And that whole sense in which something has gone really wrong when simply being pulled over because your turn signal wasn't activated as you were changing lanes leads to an arrest and an incarceration. I'd like to think that, we're Canadian, that sort of thing doesn't happen here. But as a white privileged woman, I can't be sure of that. The second story that Malcolm describes as his own. He was raised a mixed generation individual. His mother was originally from Jamaica and emigrated to England and then married his English father, and they came to Canada. He actually went to the University of Toronto. But he talks about as a young man growing up in a smaller town just outside of Toronto and being pulled over because he was going over the speed limit. And the police officer came up to him and he said, "Now, Malcolm, what are you doing?" And Malcolm said, "Oh, sorry, Ben." It was a friend of his father's, known well in the community. He actually took music lessons or something with the officer's daughter. They knew each other. A totally different scenario unfolded because they were familiar with one another, even though the police officer was white and Malcolm was mixed race. So he looked at those two experiences and realized, now why is it that one ended so disastrously and the other one didn't? And so his whole book is talking about how do we relate to people that we don't know? And how can we avoid something like this happening by getting to know people better before we jump to conclusions or get ourselves into trouble or situations like that escalate out of control. So I thought it was kind of interesting that when I think of Remembrance Day, it brought to my mind, you may have remembered, I think it was last Christmas or the Christmas before, but one of the British, I think it was a biscuit or a chocolate company, came out with an ad around Christmas, and it was the scene of the 1914 truce that happened on Christmas Eve when along enemy lines, German forces on one side of a fenced area and British soldiers on the other side of the fenced area. They had been battling and killing each other for days, if not weeks. And there was this muddy area in between filled with barbed wire and fencing, and there were dead bodies, and it was just known as no man's land. But on that Christmas Eve, someone heard somebody in this commercial, they reenact the sound of someone singing Silent Night, a carol that was well known for Christmas Eve. It was being sung in German. And the English soldiers, hearing that song wafting across the no man's land, started to join in English. And the next thing you know, soldiers were meeting and greeting each other in that in-between place, sharing pictures of loved ones, exchanging cigarettes or chocolate. The commercial even depicts them having a pickup game of soccer or football, as you would say in the UK. What made the difference? Not just for strangers, but for enemies to suddenly be able to step out of their own trenches and meet one another and exchange gifts and communicate even though there was a language barrier. This past year, for the second time, my son went to Germany to visit with a friend of his who he met at school when he was in the States. They're both golfers, so they travel around the world to different golfing tournaments. So my son Jacob was invited by his friend Jakob, who was born in Nuremberg, Germany, lives there with his family, an only child. And so he went to visit his friend Jakob, and they played a golf tournament together. And he stayed at Jakob's house, and they had meals together. And one evening, Jakob's grandmother had come to join them for dinner. And she started to, now I don't know whether or not the conversation actually happened around the dinner table or if it was a conversation that Jakob shared with Jacob later. But apparently he said, well, my grandmother's brother was a Nazi. And her other brother hid Jewish refugees in his basement. So within that one family, you had conflicting actions happening during the Second World War. And my Jacob and his friend Jakob, my Jacob is 23, Jakob is 25, they looked at each other and thought, my gosh, 2 generations ago, we would have been shooting at each other. Now we're just trying to beat each other on the golf course. Just the realization that just by a generation or two, how things can change, and that they are good friends. And Jacob has stayed in our home and been with our family, and Jacob has been with his family. And all the things that he's learning about his life and his parents' life and his grandparents' life and what they went through during the Second World War. And he's trying to mix that in with all the stories he's grown up hearing about his family's experience of that war. And yet they do it as friends. And so they're talking with each other and they're trying to understand better what this all means. Malcolm Gladwell basically concludes that whenever we are talking to strangers, people who are different from us, people that are unknown or unfamiliar, people that we don't know if we actually trust them, he suggests, first of all, reserve judgment. Don't jump to a conclusion with somebody that you don't know, because 9 times out of 10, we're wrong. He actually told the story of a woman that became the editor of many of his books, and one of his, I don't know whether it was his publicist or somebody else, had recommended this woman for the job. So she came and she was working with him for the first year, and he said, I immediately thought, I do not like this woman. I do not know why she was suggested for this job. So he kind of went along with it for the first year, and by the second year he thought, I really ought to know whether I like this, but she says some good stuff sometimes. And by the third year, he was saying, wow, I didn't like her, but she's done some amazing stuff for our company. And by the fourth year, he thought, I don't know how I could ever work without her. How many times have we met a person that, first off, we think, I don't like them? Have you ever had that feeling? I don't think I'm going to get along with this person. But so often it's because we just don't know them. We just don't know them. And we need to take the time to know one another. And the other thing that Malcolm Gladwell says, first of all, we have to reserve judgment. We have to take the time to get to know people. And the third is, we have to listen. We have to listen to the person's story. We have to listen to who they are. We can't just judge by what they're wearing or the color of their skin or the accent that they speak with. That will mislead us because we have all kinds of assumptions about what a person might be because of what they're wearing or how they talk or how they look. Now, I was driving back from Toronto the other day, and this person kept changing lanes and not putting their turn signal on. I was like, have you broken your turn signal? After about the third time, I couldn't wait to get up beside them and look and see who it was. Wow. I had to stop and think for myself, who was I expecting to see? What kind of prejudgment had I made, whether it be age or gender or nationality? It's so easy to do. Take the time to get to know the stranger. If you don't know someone, make a point of getting to know them. Introduce yourself. The more different they are from you, the harder it might be, but it's worth finding out. There are stories to be shared. There are new ways of relating to each other that we can bring about, and we could avoid some pretty awful circumstances if we just take the time to get to know one another and to listen. The last words that Malcolm writes in his book. He says, because we do not know how to talk to strangers, what do we do when things go awry with strangers? We blame the stranger. Jesus said, his final word, we are to love one another and love our neighbor as ourselves. Love our enemies. Welcome the stranger, lest we forget. Amen.